Okay. Hello, sorry about that, everyone. Technical difficulties. But if it's all right with you guys, we'll just wait a few minutes for people to roll in, and then we'll begin again.
Okay.
So welcome back. As we were going over before, we were going over how to be able to ask some questions throughout the presentation. Just to recap, you'll be able to ask through the Q&A box on your screen, or also raise your hand if you'd like to ask a live question at the end of the session during our Q&A portion. We also have French interpretation. You can turn on the French interpretation by clicking on the interpretation icon and selecting French on your bottom right of your Zoom screen. And we are very fortunate to have these presenters today with us to share their knowledge and experience of attendees that have joined our session today. And we ask that today that you communicate respectfully with all session participants. So a little bit about the Organic Council of Ontario. We are the voice of organics in Ontario. We are a member-based nonprofit association that represents the Ontario organic sector, and it is the only trade association working and advocating on behalf of the entire organic industry from field to plate. OCO has a vision of thriving local organic food systems. Our membership includes all certified organic operators within Ontario, but supporting members are our main source of revenue and also receive a lot of benefits by being our members. If you like the work that we do at OCO and you believe in a strong local organic food system, please consider becoming a member today. And for updates on organic agriculture news, resources, funding opportunities, green jobs, and more, sign up for e-news on our website, and these links will be in our chat. We also have an AGM in March, and we're currently recruiting board members, so we'll also have a link to that in the chat for nomination form. This year's conference theme was inspired by OCO's Organic Climate Solutions campaign. Throughout this campaign, it was funded by the Government of Canada Climate Action and Awareness Fund, and we want to raise awareness of the economic and environmental benefits of organic and regenerative farming practices. These resources are available to support farmers in taking up these style of practices, and you can use the link in our chat to look at our webpage on that. We would like to say a huge, ginormous thank you to Tomas Nemo for his 40+ years of commitment to the organic sector and his long-standing work with the Guelph Organic Conference, which has been an important meeting place for the sector over its many years of growth. Tomas has been a huge help behind the scenes pulling the strings this year, and while OCO will be hosting this year, the Guelph Organic Conference will continue for future years. We'd also like to say a big thank you to the Guelph Organic Conference sponsors. This work would have not been possible without their support. We thank you for all of our sponsors, and you can connect with them in our exhibit hall within the Feed Loop platform on our conference website. We'd also like to give a big shout out to our grow level sponsors, Yorkshire Valley Farms and EcoCert, and our florist level sponsors as well, Fennings Organic Farms, ProCert, Organic Systems, and Canadian Organic Growers. So we'd also like to acknowledge our appreciation and support from the Prairie Organic Development Fund and Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada for the session as being part of the 10 series of producer trainings we're hosting. And now I would like to introduce the session moderator, Gerald Poechman. Gerald and his partner Marlene have a 400-acre farm of cash grain forages and pasture in the Hanover area, and on their farm soil is managed for aggressive carbon building within the context of progressive, innovative, and productive systems. So let's give a wonderful big welcome to Gerald today.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much, Kelly.
This is a new adventure for me. I've not done mediator on Zoom before, so it's going to be difficult. I'm used to standing out in front of people, and then I can give you the stare if you don't behave. I'm going to basically give a little bit of a historical outline of where the organic beef has come since its beginnings here in Ontario, and kind of end up with some of the challenges at hand. And then Katrina and Cory will share their hands-on experiences, what they're doing and how they're doing it, and how that relates to the progress of the beef industry in Ontario. You can tell by how old I am by how old my notes are here. The organic grains began here in the mid-'80s with the Ontario Cooperative. Soon after, the organic dairymen got together and got Pine River Cheese to do some cheese by around the 1990 time. In the mid-'90s, the eggs and dairy products were being launched. One of the reasons why beef isn't in that group of offerings is that there's quite a complexity of cuts on a beef animal. And when you slaughter an animal, you have all the cuts and all the byproducts that go with it. The other issue with beef is that it's a high value protein, and the industry at the time, and still today, I think in the conventional industry, there are low margins on many of the products. The other complication we had with beef is that there were, and still are, quite a diversity of breeds and feeding programs. Another thing that hangs on from a long time back, it's the independence of producers. And I think of all of the farmers, beef farmers are probably as independent as anybody. The other issue that beef farmers would have in getting organized into the marketplace is that beef production is one of the closest production systems to a holistic on the land production programs, if you compare it at least to hogs or to poultry. Grazing is a part of even the most conventional operations, as the calves are normally born on grass. The other issue that came into play is that consumption is quite irregular. It's not like eggs where they can be bought every week, or milk the kids need every week, every day probably. Beef is something that you tend to have a specialty cut when you have company. You may end up doing burger to stretch some meat and craft dinner, but it's not something that's a daily part of the routine for most families. In the early 2000s, local and natural and grass-fed became part of the terminology and part of the marketplace. And what was happening here is that because local took off so quickly and was promoted by the provincial government, advertising and several other programs, like farmers markets, organic beef basically slid further into the background for the time being. There were some players all along, right from the very beginning, who had a vision for beef and some energy. Now, it just happens that some of those players had some really big visions and progressed rather quickly. And for instance, some of our own have been part of the A&W grass-fed program. Then BSE came in 2003. The whole industry was in a turmoil. Slaughter was slowed down, movement of beef was critically cut. There was it was a pandemic of sorts for the beef industry, and it took a little while to get things reorganized and figure out what we were doing. The result was, since probably in the 90s, agriculture has been on a steady increase of regulations brought on by public opinion, media, lots of news stories and some bad stories. And these regulations, as they progress and are instituted and are policed, keep going, and they still are today. But when the industry is at a standstill, more or less, or critically hampered for a while, when the industry comes back into something more normal, it seems like the regulations took a leap jump because nobody was watching them for a while. One of the results of that greater regulation, but also a great, I would say, impetus for it was the Bse crisis, is we ended up with a smaller number of abattoirs. Now we're probably, I forget the real numbers, but I think we're into the 10% range maybe of the number of small family operated local abattoirs that there were across the province. Where are we now? Now we have some very large retailers who are connected quite strongly with processors, large processors, in what I would term supply chains. It is very hard to get into one of those supply chains, and it is very hard to compete with them. They are very efficient and very direct, and they really hold everybody's nose to the grindstone. One of the programs that has happened in the last 10 or 15 years, it's the branding of beef. And the beef industry of Ontario has taken on the corn-fed beef. If one were to go behind that and look at where corn-fed beef is produced, primarily in feedlots, it's not necessarily what the consumers are looking for. But at the time, consumers were looking for more consistency in cut, color, and flavor. And that's something that the corn-fed beef was able to grab a hold of and put together and get it on the plate. However, this kind of branding caused further confusion. Terms like natural, hormone-free, grass-fed, 5-star Angus, all of these brands mean something different to a different group of people, and there's a fair bit of overlap between the production systems of each of these brands. Beef, however, still remains a very high-priced protein. I don't know if it's the highest-priced protein, but it is a very high-priced protein in the marketplace, and even more so exaggerated by specialty cuts. You know, steak, certain kinds of steak, you know, your tenderloin or some of your specialty cuts have very high retail values compared to burger, for instance. We also still compete against imported sales features in the chain stores. And because of the irregularity of consumption and purchasing and the high cost at the retail, I would suggest that a volatile economy reverberates through the beef marketplace quite exaggeratedly. So the challenge is now. Beginning something small is quite a hard task to do when you've got these large supply chains in full gear. In the case of beef, it's further exaggerated because a small producer may have 10 or 20 or even 50 or even 100 head per year. That's per year. It's very difficult to have them finished ready for slaughter on a regular basis. And it's very difficult to have a market that will take 1 head per week or 4 head per month. Another challenge we have is just the serious limitation, almost extinction of small abattoirs. And so what we have is a mismatch of the scale of abattoir with the scale of farm with the scale of retail. or distribution. So in other words, if a particular buyer in distribution wants to buy 1,000 pounds of product, there takes a certain scale of abattoir and a certain number of producers to produce that, and next week the order may not be there. The other issue is retailers have their own scheme of doing things, and much of the distribution is linked very tightly with retail. So when you start something new, it's pretty difficult to get into that supply chain. The challenge we still have as well is this branding. There's still much confusion out there. People are getting used to asking for 5-star Angus when they go to the restaurant, possibly looking for natural at the farmer's market or local in your local restaurant as well. And if you're out in the grocery store, corn-fed is still an issue. But the issue we have as organic producers is that many of these big companies will make similar claims to what we're doing in organic and ecological agriculture, and they take a little bit of a shortcut in terms of the production side, but they still carry a good story for their confusion. Pricing still remains a major issue with beef. A beef animal is practically 2 years old by the time it comes to market. That is a long time to be playing the markets. As a farmer, we need to buy our inputs for our crops 6 months before we plant the crop, and then we spend 2 years feeding that crop to the animal. So if there's a change in the market pricing of some of the crops, it dramatically changes our production margins. In grass-fed entirely or completely grass-finished, it's not as much an issue directly, but indirectly, it has a big impact. For instance, right now, in the last 6 months, organic soybeans have gone up 50%. What that does is create a whole lot of people growing crops to rework some of their rotations and possibly take hay or pasture out of production and go into soybeans. And eventually it comes around to creating a higher cost base for even grass-fed. Some of the nuances we have in the industry are that not very many of us consumers know that grain-fed is primarily in feedlots. And if you see some of the feedlots pictures, some of them are not very nice to look at from an ecological standpoint. Most of the feedlots in organic situations are a much smaller scale. There is shelter for the animals, and it's an entirely different presentation, but I don't think we've been effective in getting those pictures and those images out there. Grass feeding requires a fairly large land base, and for anybody who's non-current on the cost structure of land these days, it's been escalating astronomically. It's doubled probably twice in the last 10 years. What used to be, I guess I'm too old, when I started farming it was 1,000 an acre. When I moved on to the home farm here, it was 3,000 an acre. And now this same land in 25 years is now $20,000 an acre. And so as long as I'm not selling it, it doesn't matter, but it sure affects the equity position. It affects how I view my operation in terms of cash flow and in terms of managing my investments. And anybody younger in the industry, it sure impacts their debt situation and their payments. The other thing that's happening in the last decade I've noticed is that all farmers are realizing more and more how important livestock are to the viability of a cash crop land base. The manures, the rotation, just the ecology, the soil life is now becoming news, not just the manure. A few of the issues that we need to look at as beef farmers around the environment. Beef seems to have a fairly heavy load to pull in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, methane, and so forth. There are some groups out there that portray beef as being a really high water usage, and it is partially true, but it's not given in the correct light. When you feed an animal, a beef animal, forages, it takes a lot of forages to make, for instance, maybe 15 pounds of forage to make 1 pound of beef. Well, if you include all the rainfall that those forages have consumed, yes, that beef consumes a lot of water, but it's not well water, it's not groundwater, it's not water, it's not deep water, deep soil reserve water. It is rainwater. It's all there for us to use, making the grass grow. So it's really a false image. The other one is around animal welfare, and we've got some work to do in terms of having the image being positive for beef farmers. Although I would say beef farmers have the most advantage in this regard. I'm in the egg business, and it's really hard for me to give an image of chickens out there grazing grass today, but we all recognize cattle out on grass in the summertime. Productive land is becoming an issue of a sort, and that is the more productive the land, the higher the value of it is in the marketplace. And we're using much productive land to produce beef. Now, conventionally, most of that's done through grain. So that's where these feedlots get a bad rap. In a more ecologically focused system, we recognize that all of our farms have marginal or less productive areas, and those become very valuable for grazing. In some cases, we have lands that are not machine operable, and those are fantastic areas for feeding cows and their nursing young. The other thing that we need to keep an eye on is nutrient cycling. It's becoming news in the farm circles this winter now when fertilizer prices have gone through the roof, in some cases doubling or more. Some of our nitrogen sources are coming from China. So, you know, ecologically, some of these practices don't make any sense at all. But then taking a liquid beef manure out and dumping it on the land and having a big rain wash it into the creek doesn't work very well either. So I think as we mature in our understanding of the ecological cycles, the carbon cycle, the water cycle, and how the soil life really is the engine and the sponge for all of this, I think we will get over this whole nutrient fiasco and get back to more basics where livestock, in particular beef, have a very integral role to play in grazing cover crops, in keeping more grasslands, and keeping the nutrients close to the land in a way that things like dung beetles enjoy them and contribute to the ecology to a maximum. So with that, I would excuse myself as being a very long-winded introduction, and I think Jamie, is it Katrina that is supposed to be on next?
Yeah, well, welcome, Katrina.
Okay, give me a second here to find my intro. Okay. Well, thank you, Katrina, for offering your time to be with us today and give us some insights as to what you're doing. I have here some notes. After a decade away from Huron County, Katrina grew up and took over a 100-acre meeting. I better just read it as it is here. She grew up on a 100-acre meeting place organic farm in Huron County. While intent on making her own stamp on the farm, Katrina remained steadfast in her commitment to the environmentally beneficial practices her parents, Tony and Fran McQuail, have lived and farmed since '73. These practices include organic certification. The McQuails have maintained the organic status of their apples, as well as pastured pigs, grass-fed cattle, and broiler chickens for 3 decades. In addition to their commitment to organic, the McQuails have actively incorporated regenerative ag and holistic management into their operation. No small feat. Currently, Katrina serves on the Ecological Farmers Board, is the secretary for Eat Local Huron Board, and is the assistant clerk for Friends General Conference. Katrina is passionate about all things farming, but especially pigs. Katrina and her partner Ben live on the farm with their 2 young children, Stella and Imogen. Welcome, Katrina.
Thank you, Jerry. I'm just going to try and screen share, so give me 1 second. All right, how's that?
Great.
Awesome. So yes, my name's Katrina McQuail. I use she, her pronouns. Imogen is chiming in the back. Let me know if that gets too distracting. So Meeting Place Organic Farm is on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Odawa, and Mississauga. I am a white treaty person, and I'm always trying to learn about the land that I have the honor of stewarding. And so I really appreciate the reference to nativeland.ca. I was going to share that. And I always feel like the land acknowledgement is the bare minimum that I can offer. And so I wanted to also offer the resource of Chris Newman of Sylvanaqua, I'm not sure I'm going to say it right, Sylvanaqua Farm. You could follow him on social media, or I put their website at the bottom of the screen here. But I encourage folks to seek out Black, Indigenous, and people of color farmers, follow them, learn from them, from what they share, but do not to ask for their educational or emotional labor without paying them. But I found it very helpful in my farming journey. So Jerry already shared some of the farm history, but I wanted to give you a little bit more. So my folks, Tony and Fran McQuail, who are here, hi Mom and Dad, got the farm in 1973 and they went organic in 1975. They lost the crop that summer to the weather and a unfortunate, very unneighborly circumstance where someone had committed to helping them take off their crop and then didn't. It wasn't until the 1980s that they started certification, because up until that point, there really had not been any sort of formal process. And so when the Organic Crop Improvement Association started, that's when the more formal certification process happened. We, as I show on the screen, they did a 7-year rotation of grains and pasture. And so that included a fall planting of a winter grain, such as winter rye, triticale, or winter wheat, that they underseeded the next spring with a red clover. The grain was harvested that first year. Then the second year, they harvested the red clover as hay or pasture. And then in the fall, they plowed it under. And in the spring of the third year, they would plant oats and barley that was underseeded with either trefoil, alfalfa, and a grass. And then that would be a hay and pasture for the next 4 years for their 7-year cycle. Our farm is located in northern Huron County. It's a rolling hill property that has 65 acres workable. And so it is tillable or usable for cropping, but we have found that it does better under hay and pasture management. So the farm has evolved and changed over the years, depending on what has felt feasible for the farmers. And we are currently shifting and changing again. Fran and Tony are moving further and further into retirement, and I'm taking over more and more of the operation. And I've got different pictures of our cattle on the farm just so that it's more interesting than watching me talk. I took over the farm in 2016, and I'm looking to simplify the operation so that it's doable by me year round with potentially some help in the summer seasons. COVID-19, as I'm sure it has impacted everyone, dramatically changed the food landscape for us. It seems that people feel a lot less food secure and are searching for more local food, and are using and have more time, energy, and capacity to cook at home, which has meant that we've had a lot more interest in our local small farm products. 2020 was a incredibly busy year for us. And as Jerry mentioned, beef cattle don't become beef overnight. And so there was a lot of trying to explain to consumers about how long it takes to raise these animals and that process. There have also been supply chain issues. As Jerry mentioned, again, the issue around organic soy. This doesn't affect our completely grass-fed and pasture-raised cattle, but it does impact the other creatures on our farm, such as the pigs and the chickens. Our feed prices this year in 2022 for the pigs are up about 25 to 30% right now, and for chickens 60 to 65%. So that makes dramatic increases in our cost of production, which we then have to pass on to consumers. And since I get some of my certified organic hay from Jerry, I'm going to be asking him about hay prices for 2022. I have the immense privilege of having taken over a farm property and business that was already certified organic and established. And I know that's not always the case, or not often the case, for incoming farmers. The respectful and humane treatment of our animals is paramount to me. And so in general, I feel that being certified organic supports that goal. But if an animal is ill or injured, we do consult with our vet and follow their advice about what is best for the animal, even if that means taking them out of certified organic designation, because we want to make sure that we're taking care of our animals first and foremost. So some organic beef essentials. What is different in organic production systems compared to other systems? I can only really speak from my experience, and because I was raised on a certified organic farm, I don't have as much experience in conventional or other systems. So I'll speak to our operation. For our herd, we don't, again, this is in some ways obvious because we're certified organic, but I just want to articulate it. We don't use any sort of growth hormones or implants of them. We have no routine use or preventative use of antibiotics or wormers. We only use them, like I said, with a specific animal that has been identified as needing it by a vet. And then they are designated as no longer organic and clearly identified as that. We don't use any sort of fly insecticide or ear tags or other fly treatments. And so we do use fly traps out on pasture for our flies to help prevent both just the irritation of them and also pink eye. We like to set up a system that enables our animal to live a life appropriate to its species. And so with our cattle, that's allowing it to eat a diet that works with its digestive system, completely forage for us, and that gets to spend time in a herd and outside. Our cattle are only in the barn for sorting, shipping, and any sort of veterinary care. So they really spend, 99% of their life out on pasture. Even in the winter, right now, our cattle are outside, looking a lot like this. So what are some of the challenges in organic beef? As I mentioned a moment ago, pink eye can be a challenge. And these are kind of 3 stages of pink eye that I'm showing here. We had not run into it until recently in our herd. And part of that is that we opened up our herd and have been doing some custom grazing because I stopped doing a cow-calf operation. And so we've been purchasing in organic yearlings for our own use. And then we've also been custom grazing some organic yearlings. And so I think that meant that we now have an endemic pink eye issue in our herd. We have at times seen some internal parasites, but very rarely. I just checked with our butcher actually this morning, and they said that about 80% of the certified organic beef animals that they see have some internal parasites, but mostly affecting the liver. The most common internal parasite is the roundworm that can be economically important because it can reduce appetite and grazing behavior, which depresses weight gains, creates poor feed efficiency and diarrhea in calves and yearlings, and can reduce milk production and reproductive inefficiency. This is not something we've seen directly in our own, but I just wanted to share that. Other possible internal parasites would be lungworms, flatworms, tapeworms, and coccidia. And then just while I'm on, pretty pictures of things for all of you, external parasites are things like cattle biting louse, long-nosed cattle louse, the little blue cattle louse, short-nosed, as well as stable flies, horn flies, and cattle grubs. We do occasionally have some lice on our cattle over the winter. They don't normally end up looking like this picture that I pulled off the internet, but we use diatomaceous earth to sprinkle over their backs, and then we have big stiff brushes that we put up in areas that they can rub on, and that really helps them with dealing with it. But you want to make sure that you're keeping an eye on the population of parasites that your herd has. So one of the questions that I was asked to answer is to certify or not. Clearly I'm biased, we're certified. But one of the questions I would ask before to certify it or not is whether or not you want to manage your herd organically. Because you can manage your herd organically without being certified. And so there are both environmental and economic motivators. So environmental, wanting to protect the soil microbiome, plants, animals, air, water, wanting to keep, do your part to keep our earth healthy. And then there's also economic, seeing the value in potentially reducing inputs and adding value to your land through the management, and also knowing that consumers are generally willing to pay a higher price for certified organic products. For us, I have listened to my folks talk about it for enough years that I think I can speak for them. They saw the damage that had been done to the land before they were the stewards of it, by long-term monocropping, especially with corn, and major tillage erosion, as well as excessive atrazine and other herbicide and chemical fertilizer uses. And so it's really important to us, both in terms of the land, but also in terms of the safety and health of the farmers and the animals that we take care of, to not expose us to all of those different chemicals. My parents were part of a group of farmers that worked to create the organic standard and support each other in returning to a more holistic and regenerative farming practice. We've had our farm certified. We've had our farm and some of the products that we produce certified for over 30 years. and part of why we certify is that we want to support that there is a standard, because otherwise, what does the word mean? As we've seen with marketing, there's a lot of different ways that people use terms that can cause confusion and lack of clarity around what something means. And so to have an organic standard that is referenced and that you can say, this is, we follow all of this, I think is valuable. It's a short form way to let our potential customers and our customers know about what we do and believe. And we want to support other farmers in their growing organically, whether that's certified or not. And so for me, as someone who's certified, I'm sourcing the inputs and the feed and the hay that I'm feeding to the livestock on our farm from other farmers. And so I'm supporting them in doing their farming organically. Reasons why you might not certify is that it can be expensive. You have to pay your inspection and certification fees. There is the complication that if your meat is not butchered in a certified abattoir, it can't be labeled as organic. So like when I say certified abattoir, I mean a certified organic abattoir, even if it is coming from a certified organic animal. And so that's a challenge that we have. If your customers know you, there is trust and relationship without a label. And so you may not feel like you need to have the certified organic label. And like I said earlier, you can always follow the standard without certifying. And that there are now other labels that some people feel are better than organic, like regenerative or sustainable or ecologic. And so just depending on how you view the label, you may choose to go with a different way of defining what you do on your farm. Whoops, wrong way, sorry. So our practice is the what and why. Quite simply, we try and mimic what our cattle's herd and mob grazing behaviors would be like in a more in a less human intervention system. So my parents trained in holistic management, which has impacted both how they and now I farm. And so we use rotational grazing as part of our system. And though holistic management was developed by Alan Savory, I'm working to combine the learnings from that along with learning from more Black, Indigenous, and people of color leaders, especially Indigenous communities with decades of regenerative agroforestry and silviculture practice as I continue to grow and learn in our way of farming. So I'm going to show some slides of how we do our pasture moving. And this is, right now what we are doing is feeding the cattle their hay on the yard, but they have a pasture where we do feed hay sometimes and where they can loaf and eat grass through the snow. So that's what they're just coming in from that pasture in this picture that was taken earlier this winter. There we go. Okay, so all of our farm paddocks are labeled with the alphabet. And so this section that we're moving the cattle from where they've been grazing to the next section is AB. So this is Tony using his Jedi mind tricks and the Force to lure the cattle up, and they're going to move into the next section. So he's opening the gate here. And I will say that you can't really see it, but on the far side of the cattle is our high tensile boundary fence. So we use high tensile boundary fences that are permanent. And then we use temporary fencing, electric fencing that you can see in the foreground here and that Tony's opening the gate on for creating all of our paddocks, because it gives us the flexibility of moving them around as well as changing the size of them depending on how regrowth is working. So here they're starting to move in. You can see that they're walking past their water tank that's right kind of at the hip of that back red cow. And there they are. They're just about a minute. It takes us about a minute to move them because they're trained to this movement. They know to come when they see us. They want to move into the fresh pasture. It's usually very simple and straightforward. Our rotational grazing usually has them in a paddock for one day, but definitely not more than 3 because we don't want them to start re-eating the regrowth on the plants that they like the best. We find it's beneficial because due to mob grazing, they trample the waste forage into the soil, they spread their own manure, and they're not overeating any of the plants. And then this is that same pasture area after a 64-day recovery. So as you can see, there's significant regrowth, things look lush. There's starting to be a little bit of bloom on some of the legumes, but it's good eating for them. So our beef is completely grass-fed, 100%, no grains. And to that end, they're fairly lean. As you can see in the left, I think it's left for all of you, left-hand slide photo here, the 2 front carcasses are ours. And we sell our beef direct to consumers as quarters, halves, and mixed 20-pound variety packs. So Fran is holding up some T-bone steaks from a 20-pound variety pack. And what this has allowed us to do is it means that we don't have to worry about trying to sell certain cuts, right? If we were selling it by the cut, some people or most people want certain cuts, but few people want other cuts. And so then you're left with an imbalance and having to figure out what to do with those less desirable cuts. And we've been doing this for almost 50 years in some way or another, which is neat because it also means that now I have adult customers who are purchasing from me whose parents purchased from my parents. So there's a lot of long-term relationship and trust building for us in how we market our meat. We are very fortunate to have a local abattoir that we work with and feel really good about the relationship with. As Jerry mentioned, there can be some major disconnects in terms of size, in terms of distance, in terms of availability. Our abattoir has chosen not to go through organic certification. And so when our animals leave the farm to go through the processing, the meat product at the end is not considered organic or certified organic. And so we are very clear in our marketing to customers that they are purchasing an animal that was certified organic, but that the meat itself is not. And so figuring out how to communicate clearly with your customers about what exactly they're getting. Our abattoir doesn't always get it perfect. Miscommunications happen from both sides, but they're willing to work with us. They're really open to feedback. And there's a lot of trust and mutual benefit to the relationship. I was reminded just how important the relationship is. Our abattoir had a fire in June of 2020. And so fortunately they chose to rebuild and came back online this early fall, which was wonderful, but it gave me the opportunity to spend a year having to figure out how to butcher our pigs and beef without them. And it gave me a real insight into how difficult it is to find butchers, period, let alone a butcher that you can have a really good working relationship with, just because of how busy and complicated things get. So very grateful for our abattoir. So the environmental benefits of rotational grazing. We raise our cattle, of course, to have a marketable product, which is beef, but they are also tools for managing our farm. So our pasture is a sink for greenhouse gases. rotational grazing allows us to have them spread their manure, which composts directly onto our pasture. Their urine is also a component of giving back moisture, and a healthy pasture can help with clean water, soil, and air. So I'm going to show a few different images of kind of how the mob grazing and hard grazing can look. So here on one of our slopes, you can see that we have some pasture areas that are heavily trampled and eaten. And then this is that same area 63 days later. So again, there's good regrowth. We've got some blooming on the clover, but just that the resiliency of our pastures, because of how they're treated, is working for us in terms of regrowth. And that the fertility of them. So we have the urine, manure, saliva, and waste hay, and all that pasture residue contributes to feeding the soil and the soil microbes, which then come back and contribute to feeding the hay and pasture plants. So here, this is a really beaten up and packed up winter pasture. So because we don't have our cattle in the barn at all throughout the year, in the winter time, we usually designate a pasture area that's got protection. So on this pasture, the side that's behind us taking the photo has a whole bunch of our woodlot there. So they're protected from the elements. And then we accept that this pasture is going to be a little more beaten up because they're going to be on it all winter during the freezes and melts and things like that. So this is an example of it being really beaten up. This is it a little bit later, same area. But this is showing the dramatic regrowth. So you can see up in the top, the same plant is labeled, and the dramatic difference that that waiting until midsummer to graze it has allowed the plant regrowth from the completely beaten up pasture. So we use our cattle for landscaping. We use them for mowing around and under our trees, as well as for rodent control. So we try and use severe grazing between the tree areas in the fall to reduce habitat for meadow mice and voles in our windbreak plantings and in our orchard. And so here, excuse me, you can see some trees, and we've used a zigzag polytape to protect them because they will chew or rub on the trees if they aren't protected. But this allows them to get in close to graze down those grasses to not leave a habitat. We've recently switched, it's harder to see in this image, but on the right-hand side, there's a row of trees here in the snow that have some pigtail posts around them. And we've moved to a square pattern, and we're trying that out because it lets the cattle get in a little bit closer to graze off those grasses more thoroughly. So talked about protecting trees, but in the case that you are wanting to remove things that are growing up, so an example here, willows, we've got this area that keeps self-seeding with willows. We use the animal impact and herd effect to try and dissuade them from growing. And so here the salt and mineral feeder has been placed in the center of this little growth. So this is before they've been let in. And then we move the cattle into the area. Some are headed for the salt and mineral directly. And then the day after, so you can see that they've defoliated the willows and trampled them. And so they help us keep trees from encroaching into the areas that we've designated as pastures. And we also use them for clipping off weeds that we don't want to have. And so here there's a Canada thistle just poking up in front of this big stone. And as soon as they were let into the pasture, we had a beef animal that, for whatever reason, due to the mineral content or something, really wanted to eat that Canada thistle. And we had 35 animal units on that 2/3 of an acre for a day. And they had eaten up that Canada thistle, as well as other Canada thistles in the pasture. And so it means that we don't have to do any sort of mowing to prevent weed distribution in our pastures. There's the occasional one that has gotten too mature or burdock, and in those cases we do some hand clipping when we're out there moving the cattle. But as they say, a farmer's footsteps can be the best investment in your farm. And so the fact that one of us is out there every day to move the cattle and feed our pigs and move horses and move the chickens means that we're constantly observing both what's happening with the livestock, but also what's happening on the land. And so it gives us a real opportunity to stay connected and in tune with what's going on. The economic benefits of rotational grazing. So rotational grazing can provide a higher live weight gain per acre than a conventional grazing system. And a properly managed tame pasture can provide a return per acre equal to or better than the same land and other crops. And more efficient pasture use and livestock management can result in a higher net economic return to the producer. So a high stocking density is more efficient. Doing the paddocks allows for an easier intensive management system. Having good forage increases the grazing efficiency, and rotating the herd prevents overgrazing. And of course, as I just mentioned, closer contact with the herd means better livestock management. So there are a lot of economic benefits from rotational grazing. One of the ways that we like to use it is for mineral nutrient cycle. So I would do a disservice if I didn't talk about manure. And we use our manure for a multitude of things. And one of them is that we use it to replant a lot of the plants in our grazing rotation. So we mix legume seeds into our cow's mineral. And so when they are eating their mineral, they ingest the legume seeds. They're too small to be digested. And so they go through the cattle's digestive system and then are pooped out in their manure. And then our seeds have this really lush place to germinate. So you can see them here in this picture because it rained on that cow pie. And so you can see the seeds kind of got rinsed off. But it allows them to have a nutrient-rich, moist place that doesn't have a lot of competition because they're not being overshadowed to germinate. And so here is germinating trefoil and clover. So we really like to use that as a way of reseeding our pastures. And we haven't had to do tillage on our pastures to replant them or broadcast seeding since the last time we did it, I think in 2014. So it's been a while. I was asked to speak a little bit to the changes over time, and I just thought this picture was a fun one. So the organic matter in our fields has increased. We have dramatically more earthworms and earthworm castings on the surface of the soil. We also have an increase in pollinators and other beneficial insects. And we do soil sampling, and I'm again very privileged in that my parents started doing all of this stuff in the early mid-70s, and so I have a lot more information about where our farm started at the point that they took over stewardship of it and where we are at now. And so it's really easy for us to see the dramatic benefits of rotational grazing and organic management of livestock on our farm. So as I was talking about the pastures enhanced biodiversity, so the very first picture up in the left is a praying mantis egg cluster. And then there's a bumblebee on the alfalfa there and a toad. So we see a lot of different creatures in our walks. There are tons of birds, that are there, especially now that we've planted in more windbreaks, songbirds and grassland birds. Here's a praying mantis and also a spider web. Climaxic challenges. As you're all aware, in Ontario, the temperature fluctuations in the winter can lead to it being wet and muddy and the cattle being outside and wet. They do have a rumen that is essentially a fermenter, and I just lost my headpiece. Okay, sorry. They do have a rumen that ferments and provides a lot of internal heat for them so that they can stand cold temperatures, but they do need to have shelter from wind and ideally a source of water. They can lick snow, but they prefer liquid water if they can have access, and that helps with their gaining. They will stay pretty healthy outside if they have shelter, especially if the alternative is a humid barn. So we like to keep ours outside as much as possible. Here's a photo of one of our beef cows grazing through the snow in December. And then here's us feeding winter hay on pasture. And so what we like about that is that it gives both the humans and the horses a little bit of exercise in the winter. And it keeps everyone, the cattle, the horses, and the humans outside getting vitamin D as well. And what's great about feeding hay on pasture is that then the waste hay residue becomes part of the soil fertility as it gets decomposed in the summer. And we like to see this because the thick snow, or the thick snow on the cattle indicates that their coats have thickened and that they have enough fat layer that they are well insulated and the snow is not melting, so they are comfortable and staying dry instead of being wet. I'm sure I could talk about more, but I'll stop there and we can do the questions at the end of the session. But I'm happy to be in touch if anyone has other questions that we don't get to. You can contact me there, and thank you for inviting me to share. I think we'll pass it on to Cory and whoever is introducing Cory.
Thank you very much, Katrina. An awesome overview of your operation over time. It's always nice to see those cattle in both winter and summer. There, I think my technology works. I'd like to introduce Cory. Cory Van Grunigan is a beef farmer and abattoir co-owner with his brothers. BG Meats is a local family-owned company that specializes in small herd, high-care beef from production all the way through to retail. With their goal of producing the best beef in the world right here in Ontario, they are committed to taking a long way around and producing the highest quality product. In addition to running the BG Haldeman farm located in Cayuga, just Simcoe, Ontario, with his wife Heidi, Cory is also referred to as BG Meats in-house politician. He is often meeting with officials on behalf of the beef industry, as well as attending meetings and conferences to promote the mission and mandate of BG Meats. And I would also add he's quite an innovator with holistic grazing and some adaptive processes there, and we'll hear more of that. Welcome, Cory.
Thank you very much, Gerald. So yeah, I'll just give a quick rundown of our operations. I'd like to get into more of the why and provide some context for that as well. So I'm farming here in Cayuga with my 4 daughters and wife, as well as we've got a small team of farmers, fairly new farmers. They're not old hands by any means, but they're doing a great job and learning the ropes of looking after cattle and chickens, and we've got a few pigs and On the farm, my daughters also look after some laying chickens and rabbits and turkeys as well. So quite a few animals on the farm here. We have a herd of about 200 mama cows, and then we work with about 60 other producers around, well, farm families really around Ontario to supply our retail stores as well as retail stores through the GTA. And so we've really found a good partnership there and good locations that are, support the same why that we do. And so that's been great for us to do that. We have had put in our time, as Gerald was mentioning, with some larger retailers who didn't necessarily have the same why that we did. And so that, it was just better not to try and make that fit together. So and Gerald and Katrina did a really good job of sort of speaking to, the complexity really that we have in front of us. And so I've spent my career really living in that complexity and trying to seek out, a way to have the outcomes be positive, have good outcomes associated with that. And so that I really appreciated when I found holistic management and the work that Alan Savory has done in the past. And so Tony McQuail is a pioneer in Ontario as far as holistic management. So thank you to Katrina and her father for that good work as well. I am now an accredited professional in holistic management and also eco-region or a hub verifier for the Savory Institute here in Canada. So Dana Penrice and I are the two right now accredited in Canada to do that. And so that has been really my mission for the past number of years, is to apply holistic management in our context and help hopefully the farmers that and customers and employees that we have understand the complexity in their own context and how to lead to positive outcomes as well. So I just want to sort of set that up as a bit of context. I want to sort of delve into a little bit more about why I think it's so important for animals to be on the land and to be included in an organic system as well, even though it is complex and complicated, and there's lots of technical reasons why it's not easy. I'd still like to sort of give that encouragement if I can. And so I'm going to try sharing a screen here. Let me know if you can see that okay.
Yep, we can see it. Thanks.
We're good. Okay, great. So, so a little bit about, I'm just going to rearrange the screen here. Okay. Okay, so, this is something that I'm certain I'm preaching to the choir here with this one, is that, over the past 40 years, 1/3 of farmable land has been lost, and it's been desertifying. It's probably been developed. But desertification is certainly a huge issue across the planet. But even in our own, area, this is an old graphic, but it's still relevant, I'm sure. Looking at soil degradation, we are farming in degraded soils here in southwestern Ontario, southern Ontario, as a lot of the crop growing areas or the productive areas are as well. And so that that's something that's not often talked about, is the problems of our soil. It's a bit like We're the Frog, and the boiling water, the warming water, is just the degradation of the soils around us. It's happening slowly, but it's significant over time. And so that's certainly a part of it. This whole concept of complexity is something that when I was able to hear the holistic management trainers and practitioners referred to it, I said, yes, that's absolutely true for sure. I also have a master's of science in ag economics, and sometimes the sciences really don't do a great job of providing answers about complexity, because science by definition is about reductionism. We want to reduce it down to individual parts so that we can make it a complicated problem rather than a complex problem, because complex problems are always changing, they're self-regulating, they're self-organizing. Unfortunately, when a species goes missing in an ecosystem, the ecosystem doesn't stop working. It continues on, it adapts, it evolves. Whereas if you take a battery out of a car, it does not adapt to not having a battery. So you put the battery back and it works again. So these are two different things. And I think it's important to recognize that. Alan Savory certainly did that. As I've been reading a lot of books. It's recently that have also been, this has been a stated problem in a lot of different places by a lot of authors and thinkers and probably institutions as well. So referring specifically to Alan Savory and his work, he made 4 key insights, and these happened over time. They didn't happen all of a sudden, and so certainly his position has changed over the 60 years or 70 years perhaps that he's been developing his frameworks in holistic management. So one of those key, I'll just kind of go through those 4 key insights. So one of them is that nature functions in wholes. And this is really a story about, not being able to reduce things down to the nitrogen of the soil and have that tell us the entire picture about, grass production or grass growth. There's a lot more to it than just the nitrogen levels, obviously. And so this applies, not only in nature, but in social systems and in financial systems as well. And so you can consider your position as connected to a number of other wholes, and that those wholes all functioning within a larger whole. The interesting extension of that is that there are no externalities. So when something affects someone, it affects us because we are part of this web of holes within holes. The largest hole that we'd consider is the entire planet. And so, no externalities to that entire planet. Here's a pretty good quote from Alan is, not only is the world more complex than we understand, it's more complex than we can ever understand. For centuries, humans have tried to manage land with little success because on its own, land is not manageable. The land is so tied to the culture of the people and to the economy that all 3 need to be managed indivisibly, as we do when we manage holistically. So something to keep in mind as we're managing complexity. I'm sure this weighs on every person out there managing something complex. Another of the key insights is that brittleness affects how the land responds. I think this is a particularly important insight when people are considering options or reading about what a producer does elsewhere, probably in a lot of different ways, but in this one we're particularly talking about the landscape and brittleness. Brittleness is essentially, you can think about it as a scale, 10 being the driest desert, very little rainfall or none, and 1 being tropical rainforest. It's about the persistence of moisture in the environment. We can have, and this is different than rainfall. So rainfall can be equal. There's places in South Africa that receive, a meter of rainfall. I receive a meter of rainfall as well, but we would be very, very different on the brittleness scale because maybe in South Africa, they get all that rain in 4 months. And here it's spread out, distributed through the entire year. And so brittleness has a lot of impacts on that ecosystem. Even in our very non-brittle ecosystem, we can get into some very, poor systems, so we're non-brittle. Non-brittle, you might say in non-brittle environments, you'd likely have more trees depending on the temperature and the climate surrounding that. But yeah, it can affect in many different ecosystems, not just farmland as well. Another key insight is that landscapes evolved under predator-prey relationships. I find this is something that that applies in many different ways. I think about this in ways that we manage information as well in complex systems. Sometimes in order for something to live, something else must die. And in our own social regeneration that we're carrying out inside of our organization, we refer to this often as that there is a life cycle. There is something that there is living and dying all the time, and then there's the transformative phases in between, of course. Anybody on a farm, knows how we can use this as sort of a management tool to help us be able to develop and carry out the landscape that we want to. The fourth key insight is that overgrazing is a function of time and not numbers. And so this is very important piece, and I could see really good examples in Katrina's slides of where this is managed really well over at the McQuail farm. And so this has been a mistake that humans have been made for thousands of years. A lot of that desertification gets blamed on livestock, overgrazing. The problem is that it's not the number of animals, it's the amount of time those animals are there. So a good example that Alan uses quite often is an example of donkey days. So can you imagine the difference if you took a donkey to a riverbank to drink, or let the donkey go to the riverbank to drink for 365 days? Versus, and contrast that to bringing 365 donkeys to a riverbank to drink for one day. And I think you could imagine, if you go and look at that on any other day besides the day that the 365 donkeys were there, you'd have a very different landscape. And, the plants would be in a much different shape and phase of recovery and so on. If that one donkey goes down there every single day, he's going to pick the ones he likes the best. There's going to be shrubs that he doesn't like left to rest and overgrow and just not photosynthesize well. So all those very important sort of key insights in our farm. And so here we see some of that whole displayed. This is a very non-brittle pasture with, these cattle are rotated daily on our farms as well. This is actually during calving season. I don't know if you can see it well, but there's probably about 3 newborn calves all within about 24 hours old in that frame, maybe 4. And then, get to a completely different environment. This is West Bijou, where I was trained at the Savory Institute Ranch there in Colorado. And this is a very brittle environment. And so you can kind of see the difference that we're talking about there. So what's important is we need to understand these insights if we're going to make judgments about whether something like an action like grazing beef on your place is good or bad. And if the results that we're getting from doing that are good or bad, or helping the ecosystem and so on. So, just as a reminder, maybe to some, the ecosystem processes that we use to, understand what's happening in the ecology, our water cycle, mineral cycle, energy flow, and community dynamics. And what we're trying to do, speaking now about the ecology and managing our complex ecologies on Ontario farms, is we want to be moving these in the right direction. We want them trending. So it's trending in the right direction based on management, really. our management is going to help these along. That predator-prey relationship is alive and well, and so we need to be able to incorporate all those insights into our management. In the holistic management framework, there's basically a number of tools that we get to use as humans, and for so this is something that's an interesting piece that I hadn't really thought about in the past. But basically, we have 4 tools that we can use as land managers to create the landscape that we want for our families and for ourselves and for our communities. So we have technology. So technology is a very it's a huge category. Obviously, there's lots of different tools. All the way from a spoon or a cup, all the way up to an iPhone or a camera. So all sort of fit in within technology. Probably soon after that, we as a species figured out how to use fire as a tool. And so this is something that's been used for thousands of years as well to hunt with and to change the landscape. And then probably only since we've been in agriculture have we recognized rest as a tool as well, from fallowing land to allowing a forest to grow with rest. So that's sort of another management tool that we have. And the last is living organisms. So specifically animal impact and grazing. And so using animals as a tool to sort of create that ecosystem. And so humans use our creativity and either or both money and labor to be able to wield those tools again to create hopefully the ecological outcomes that they're intending to. But that's just talking about the ecosystem, of course. And so there are social and economic things that we need to consider when making our decisions. For us, maybe I'll just stop sharing here. For us on our farm, we try to consider we do consider all these things every single day, and we're trying to get better and better at them all the time, use more inputs to help us identify what might happen if we if this was a decision we made years ago, stop using dewormers in our herd. What would happen to the network connections or the community dynamics in our soil? Would we see dung beetles come back? Would we see more earthworm populations and so on? And so a decision like that isn't for us just about necessarily the parasite loads of the animals, but also what it's doing to the land as well. And then what would those community dynamics in the soil or the biodiversity in that soil do to water cycle? And then would we be able to capture more sunlight and grow more grass and then feed more cattle? And then you create this 1 + 1 number, 1 + 1 = 3 sort of result. And that's what we're after. So I guess that's a long-winded way of setting up the context to identify why it's so important for our family to have animals on the land. And I'd suggest, if anyone does some of this work themselves, if they're a land manager making decisions on the land, they might want to make sure that they're working with a full toolbox. So not just using 3 out of 4 tools available to them, but maybe, adding animals and incorporating that, 4th tool as something that can help them achieve better ecological outcomes, hopefully better social outcomes. Katrina spoke to that as well, and financial outcomes as well. So I'll leave it there if that's okay, and have Gerald come back.
Thank you very much, Cory. That gives us some more of those dandy pictures and some tools and some. You had 4 well, I'm a loss of words there. You had 4
Ecosystem
areas. What was the ecosystem?
processes.
Processes. Okay, good. So we have a couple of questions coming in there. Katrina, did you see the first one there? Is there a good reason to move or some reason that one should consider moving from cow-calf to purchasing yearlings?
Yeah, so and sorry, my earbuds died, so hopefully my audio is still good. So my folks started out purchasing in yearlings and then moved to cow-calf because it was so hard to access certified organic yearlings, and the person they were getting them from was going out of the business, so they bought his herd. And then I think 3 years ago, I went out of cow-calf, not because I don't love it, but because we were starting our family and I was looking to reduce my workload in the winter. And we had friends that were looking to increase the number that they were stocking. And so we were able to create a contract and agreement that I sold them our herd, essentially all of our cows, and then they've guaranteed me that I get my calves back, that I purchase my calves back from them. And so that worked really well for us. But in terms of reasoning, it was just I was trying to reduce my personal workload. But I really like having the cow-calf operation, and we'll go back to it hopefully when my life is a little simpler, in like 10 years.
Thank you. This next one's a general question. Does anybody know of how we can prove to the public that our whole farm system is a lower emitter of greenhouse gases? Is there anybody working on that, Cory?
As a matter of fact, there is. So one of the things that was there was a lot of things that were attractive for me for holistic management, and specifically involvement with the Savory Institute. One of them is Ecological Outcome Verification. So the acronym on that, like we need another acronym, is EOV. So Savory has developed scientifically proven, very rigorous, science-backed way to determine both lagging indicators of ecological regeneration, so regenerative outcomes, as well as the leading indicators of regenerative outcomes. In southwestern Ontario, there's 14 leading indicators on or slightly above the soil surface. We're actually right now training our second cohort here in Canada to become ecological monitors. And that's through Holistic Management Canada. I'd encourage you to Google that. We've got a conference coming up as well in February that I can put a plug in for right now, that people might want to check out if they want to sort of hear a little bit more. It's more of a panel like this, but Dana Penrice and I are training ecological monitors. So really those leading indicators are doing a good job of pointing to that we're moving in the right direction, so that the lagging indicators are increasing. Because that, assuming we want them to increase, whatever the metric is. So soil carbon, soil organic matter could be increased biodiversity, water infiltration are all lagging indicators. We've got 14 leading indicators that tell us we're going to be going in that direction. And for a land manager, that is so important to know, to not have to wait 5 years to see if your management decisions over the past 5 years have led to positive outcomes. So to know the next day, to be able to see what's happening on the ground, and understand those and have words for them and so on, and eyes for them, it's so important. So Savory Institute is working on that. The answer to the question specifically is there is a label that Savory have identified called land to market. And there are some big brand supporters of that in the US. Timberland, for example, Timberland is a leather goods outerwear brand from the US, I believe. They are selling a regenerative boot now. So leather from animals raised on lands that are verified or to be improving the ecological outcomes. So just as sort of a quick example, and a couple of things to Google there: Land to Market, Savory Institute, EOV as well, Ecological Outcome Verification, and Holistic Management Canada.
Thank you, Cory. I just put a little plug in there for something like leading indicators. It's a term that we're not familiar with in conventional agriculture, but it's as obvious once one gets on your knees and starts looking in the pasture. It's as obvious as deciding not to buy fertilizer so much this spring. I know that my bank account has more money in it, and I know I've made a gain to some degree, but I don't know the final outcome until later on, or if I choose a different variety. So it's kind of nice to have those indicators to show us immediately, like you say, what's changing as a response to some management that I've decided to change. Katrina, do you have an answer for this support system helping farmers obtain certification?
Yeah, so I just shared in the chat that there is a Canada Organic Trade Association does have a way of reimbursing farmers who are in their first, second, or third year of pre-certification, or farmers who want to increase their organic acreage to support that. I'm sure there are other programs I'm not familiar. So if you or Cory or any of the Organic Council folks or people here want to share what they know, please throw that in the chat or speak up. But yeah, it can be quite difficult.
Thank you, Katrina. I'm glad you answered on the chat there. I missed that. Cory, have you got this question?
Give it to me again, please.
How can we affect change and convince small cow-calf farmers who may have off-farm jobs and very little time to change their grazing practices and help them move away from set stock grazing?
So this is, this is a perfect plug for, well, it depends. So what it depends on, this is, for me, this is something that's frustrated me for years until I recognized why. Holistic managers would answer that, a very specific question like that with "it depends." So it depends on the other parts of their context. Time was mentioned there. That can be a huge impact in their own, in their own social regenerative outcomes that they need to manage. Financial certainly is one as well. And then the ecology is the third, of course. So, so my specific answer to the question is that they need to understand their context, and they need to have some idea, holistic management. One of the parts of setting your context is you basically say the life you want, including how you want the land to be. And so then you start managing in that direction. It's much easier to manage in a direction rather than to identify all the decisions, all the actions you need to take to get there in advance. And so, it would really depend on that each individual's own context. And so how we encourage them to do that, I could say fairly, I would probably wager something that, the proper grazing methods would make the financial outcomes for this individual probably better. I think we could change the, as Katrina said, it doesn't take long to rotate cattle in a pasture if they have a minute, if they can be there a minute before it gets dark. They could do, holistic planned grazing, hopefully, rather than just rotational grazing. But that's yeah, that's I think with the right training, holistic management training specifically, we could encourage them or give them the tools that they need or the understanding to be able to do what we think could be better for the ecology.
Thank you, Cory. Carolyn, it sounds like you have something to say. Hi.
Unmute.
Are we able to get Carolyn to come in?
Hello, can you hear me?
Now we can.
Okay, great. I was just going to add, I added in the chat already about the part of the question about metrics that there's, and I saw Katrina added this to the chat, so I wasn't gonna say much after that, but the Farmers for Climate Solutions coalition that OCO and EFAO are a part of also has a whole bunch of references in a lot of the documentation that they've been sharing with government. So if you go to the Farmers for Climate Solutions website, they do have quite a bit of evidence to share behind the practices that they put forward. And I hear what Cory's saying, which is like, you can't just say rotational grazing has this impact. You know, every system is different and you have to look at it differently. But for sure, there's some stories and that can be spoken of from the science that's been done. And there's also an example of two researchers at the University of Guelph who are doing some interesting work on soil health in grazing systems. And that's Dr. Kim Schneider and Claudia Wagner. I can't remember the last part of her name. Somebody else can maybe fill it in. So that's there. And then Jamie didn't throw this in the chat yet, but we should, which is the Organic Climate Solutions website, which OCO has been building, is also referencing a whole bunch of great evidence that folks can use to build the support for what they're doing. And that's all I have to say.
Great, thanks, Carolyn. Those are good questions when it takes people in higher levels of information to be able to answer them. Cory, I have a question for you. Can you give us a short description of the difference between planned grazing and rotational grazing?
Yeah, so if you're ever interested in the science, there is holistic, what's meant by holistic planned grazing is also referred to as adaptive multi-paddock grazing, so AMP. So the AMP grazing, the idea, the adaptive part of that is that the management changes depending on, again, it depends, right? So what's it depend on? It depends on how quickly the grasses are regrowing or the plants are regrowing, the target species that you're trying to manage. It also depends on the number of paddocks you have, the number of herds you have. And so there is rigor, there's math to it. But rotational grazing, the idea would be that you just every 2 days you move move a group, you know, every 2 days or whatever, irregardless of what's happening, how fast the grasses are regrowing or how many herds you've got on your farm or so on. And what that fails to necessarily recognize is the time function in Alan's key insights, which is, you know, that you want to allow grasses to recover. That changes throughout the year, throughout the circumstance, from year to year as well. And so it's really a way, a methodology to develop a new grazing plan every single year, depending on the year, depending on how many animals there are, or how many groups actually specifically. So that's the difference, as I understand it.
Now we know why Cory likes the complexity of life, because he gave us a very straight, simple, forward answer there. Yeah, it's a little more complicated, but it's generally intuitive once you have the basic information. I think I find that you know when you need to move to the next paddock and how long they'll last there, and what species you're trying to feed. But you need to walk out there every day to have a peek and see what's going on. We have a question from Chris. Do you have any sense, Cory, what the equation of energy into food might be?
Hmm.
And even just generally, I think you could answer that.
Well, okay, so, speaking of the ecosystem processes, what I like about looking at it from that point of view is that, I don't know if you noticed it, but one of the items there wasn't a cycle. So it was energy flow in the ecosystem processes, basically, identifying, how much sunlight we're actually capturing. And so, so I tend not to think about what I'm sure the math can be done, and I'm sure somebody out there is doing the math, but we waste so much sunshine, and so if we can only just capture more of the free stuff, and so how do we do that? Well, specifically speaking to photosynthesizing, we want really dense leaves. We want leaves held at different angles. We want different shapes of leaves. We want leaves there through the entire growing season, not just for part of the growing season. And so for me, it's not so much about how much we're converting rather than, how little we waste or how little we can waste possibly. And so that's why it's so important. I think there's, just thinking about the sun, the energy flow, you can see why you want a perennial crop. And then you can start asking, well, okay, how do I convert that into something that's sellable or into food? Well, cattle do a pretty good job. There's other ruminants that'll do well as well, of course, but so that's why, I think understanding your own context and the ecosystem processes, you'll see how important it is to capture more of that, and some cropping systems are identifying that and leveraging that as well, right? So having, not only a growing leaf, but a growing root in the soil all year long as well. So that's good, and we're identifying that sort of thing. So I don't know the math on the conversion. I'm sure somebody's out there has done that. I haven't.
Thanks, Cory. I'm a little more simplified. I took that to mean fossil fuel energy into food production. And if you were to compare a grazing system to a grain system, I didn't notice any machinery on either of your two pictures today. So, the energy we're talking about is harvesting sunlight. There's a little bit of activity involved in making hay for these cattle for the winter, but by and large, there's almost no nitrogen bought for the farm, organic or otherwise, and nitrogen is the biggest energy dump for fossil fuels. So, yeah, I think your grazing scenario is as close as we can get to just harvesting that sun energy and getting it directly into the food chain. Katrina, do you have a comment to make about certification at the abattoir? We do know you did say that the abattoir needs to be certified in order for you to carry the chain of certification through to retail. Not sure what else we're looking for here.
I can share a little bit. So historically, what needed to happen is Carolyn answered in the Q&A section that they needed to have an attestation of compliance, which they did separately, but that my understanding based on an interaction with our certifier EcoCert 2 years ago was that the abattoir now needs to separately certify. Like before, I could have certified them under my, like when I was doing my process, but now the abattoir needs to do a separate certification. It could have changed. Our abattoir wasn't interested in pursuing it at that point, and so we just dramatically changed how we labeled our meat.
I have a question here from Doug and Linda that I'd like to maybe poke at a little bit. I know where Doug farms, and I know that Linda takes his time and he doesn't get out to do his haying when the sun's shining. I'm just kidding. I think perhaps this would be a place where managing those 4 tools would be an advantage. Identifying those 14 regenerative indicators. And I do cheat a little bit. I gotta admit, the thing that's got me saved in the last, it's not even 10 years yet, I just decided that I'm going to cut hay when the hay is at its prime feeding value. I watch for 3 sunny days, but I bale it on the 3rd day and I wrap it. So I'm a real sinner in terms of plastic use. Luckily up here we have a recycling program, but I'm able to manage the hay and the process, the cutting and the making of quality hay much better. In other words, a little bit like the adaptive grazing. I can cut it when the hay should be cut. I'm not waiting on 5 days of sunshine. And I've been quite effective in getting regrowth. One of the little tricks I've done is cutting higher, leaving more of it in the field to shade the soil. Another thing we can do is diversify some of the species, so we get some of those low ground covering species like the white clovers will stay down in under the hay and keep the soil cooler so that we get over the dry time. What else have we got here? We have a question about lab-grown meat. Does anybody want to tackle that? No? You know, go ahead, Cory.
Just the point that doesn't lab grown meat is fine if your context doesn't necessarily include clean water on the beach for your grandchildren 30 years from now. It's my way of saying that, where does that material come from? What are we going to do instead to regenerate the soil that we all need in order to live, and the clean water and the air as well. So I just think it's it's a band-aid solution to something that we've got a solution that's thousands of years old here, and it's been proven to work. So that's my opinion.
Yeah, we need to really do a little deep thinking and a little forward proposition on that one. I have a question here. It has to do with the affordability of beef, and I'll jump in on that because I was the one that talked about its expense. I think there's 2 or 3 ways of dealing with that, and one is if you buy the kind of beef of which we were speaking about producing today, you may find that you do not need to eat as much of it. And in so doing, you actually increase the longing for having another sample of it in the near future. But I know, as I'm a great meat consumer, I love to have my 2-pound steak, but we can get by eating much, much less of it. And a grass-finished animal probably has a little more grain, a little more texture to it. And if we cook it and marinate it effectively, we can probably get as much chew, but every bite has awesome flavor and depth to it that you don't mind chewing it because every bite is awesome. And you really don't need that much of it. That's just my opinion. If anybody got another idea on that?
Mm-hmm. For in years past, so we sell beef by the cut and in a retail case, full service, and as well as packaged and so on. So yeah, part of our job, we buy them in whole carcasses, whole live animals. We have to be able to sell whole animals because otherwise that's not going to work. So so it's always for us, it's adjusting prices, it's educating customers and so on. But the other thing that strikes me is that the concept of no externalities, right? So it's part of a healthy diet, and I think I know myself, when I eat the things that, none of us should eat, the refined sugars and so on, I know I've got swelling and inflammation, and that can't be good for long-term health. And so I think eating beef will keep me healthier longer, more productive in the long term. And so that's the other part that I include in the cost of beef, is maybe we don't get the same externalities or costs for the healthcare system that we would eating refined, if refined sugars are the alternative. If they're not, and if it's, all vegetables perhaps, or something like that, we also have to consider the ecological outcomes of having bare soil, every single year, turned every year without a a rotation into perennial crops. So it's contextual. It's, we live on the land, we live here in Ontario, we need food. What are we going to do about it? How are we going to get it? How are we going to make sure that we're improving the ecological processes as we make food, because it's possible. And I think that, regardless of how you choose to eat, somehow animals are going to have to be in that mix. And so how are we going to use them? How are we going to include them? How are we going to live with them? So that's maybe a broad answer without much depth, but that's what I think about with a question like that.
Thanks, Cory. Yeah, one of the things that we learn with higher priced food is that we're less willing to waste it. And also as well, when you know where it comes from and the heart and soul of the people involved, the community, and even extending that to the soil community and the animal community into this food, you really do appreciate that it's not something to be taken lightly, and we certainly don't waste any of it. I apologize for clicking out here sometimes. I seem to have intermittent internet. I guess we're winding down in time here pretty soon. Maybe I should put Jamie on for final wrap up, or is it you, Kelly, who's going to make final wrap up comments?
It'll be me today.
Well, I want to thank Katrina and Cory there for being with us and presenting with us so freely and interacting with us and keeping the family. It's always great to see some family on the screen there and bouncing around. It's fantastic. Go ahead, Kelly.
Thank you. So again, similar to you, we want to thank everyone for attending today's session, and a big thank you to all of our speakers, interpreters, and sponsors. We are asking if you could please provide us with session feedback. A link to the feedback survey has been shared in the chat and will be included in a Zoom follow-up email. This info helps us improve your experience at the Guelph Organic Conference. Additionally, if you are interested in learning about more about the premium meat market in Ontario, OCO has created a report that we are also going to link in the chat that you're more than welcome to look at as well. Our next session is happening this afternoon, and it's called Considering the Benefits and Challenges of Different Approaches to Labor in Organic Production, and it's going to happen from 2:30 to 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. During this little break here, please take advantage of the conference platform. Go ahead and check out the virtual trade show, speak to the exhibitors in the exhibit hall, and browse the virtual trade show booth profiles, and you can chat with the reps as well. Additionally, on the Feedloop platform, there's a networking session under the groups tab, and there are a couple rooms set up for those who would like to discuss the session content any further. So again, thank you very much to everyone who attended, all our speakers, and we look forward to seeing you in the next session.
Thank you to OCO for making all this possible.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, we all good?
Yes, we should be good. We're just keeping everything open in case people want to go over some of the questions in chat.
Sure.
And then, but you're more than welcome to leave and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Okay, you as well. Bye.